I would now, Rebecca, will you take the floor, please?
6,000 homeless veterans have died since 2010. In the course of my work, activities for Unite Community, I regularly meet these homeless veterans outside Colchester Job Centre. They're there to claim social security. We pay taxes. Rightly, we expect to be able to claim social security in times of need. But the system is brutal. You don't need to spend long talking to people outside any job centre before someone will tell you that their mental health has deteriorated, or that they've tried to end their life while in the process of making a social security claim. 600 police stations have been closed down since 2010. Knife crime is rife. It feels like we're under attack and unprotected, can't think beyond the next meal, people have told me recently. Yet, as everybody's mentioned, the government congratulates itself on record high employment. But what kind of employment is a 4-hour-a-week contract or a 0 hours contract? Work isn't enough. Again, it's in the report. And that's spot on. I'll explain. Someone I know, let's call him Ernest, works in education. He works 31 hours a week for, get this, 13,000 a year. But housing costs 9,000, council tax costs 1,800. He's a volunteer firefighter 4 hours a week. It costs Ernest 2,400 a year in train fares to get to his job, just 30 miles away. The local rail service is 40% owned by a Japanese company. Shareholders are mostly banks. The company made profit last year of almost $4 billion US. Ernest feels this injustice every time he buys a train ticket that he can't afford. But he doesn't have money for food, energy, water, or internet. So he's forced to claim universal credit and sign an agreement with the state to endeavour to find better paid work and more hours. And this agreement is subject to punishment by sanctions. Listen, Amber Rudd, we say welfare is vital. Stop sanctions today. Listen, Amber Rudd, we want jobs that pay, the real living wage. It's not fair that the corporations are being allowed to grow. Corporations are global monsters eating away at our humanity and facilitated by governments all over the world. Why has this been allowed to happen? All humans are born equal on this, our planet. We have human rights. As such, we have social rights, rights to adequate standards of housing, health, education, and social security. But as this report highlights, we're on a frightening trajectory. More and more people are being denied these social rights. People I speak to on the streets of northeast Essex say, oh, but human rights are for people in war zones and despotic rulers or areas prone to climate catastrophe, not relevant in the world's rich countries. But the UK today is in crisis. Displaced people are sleeping on our streets. Thousands of people are left eating scraps and living on the margins. The report confirms this. We're in danger because corporations rule while people are being allowed to perish and die from poverty. I'm a worker, not a human rights expert. But in preparation for this meeting today, I've been thinking a lot about human rights. Its premise, and I don't need to tell it, but I'm going to, is that all humans are born free and equal. It's so simple and so beautiful. Human rights aren't some ideal that we'd need to start a campaign for. We have them already. Here we are at the United Nations Human Rights Council. We can realise our social rights and place them at the heart of our activities in our unions, in our organisations, our faith groups, at board meetings, policy forums, and most importantly in the UK, across all political parties. We can network locally and globally to take back control from corporations and reset the balance of justice according to social rights. Finally, local authorities need a legally binding social rights mandate. Rats as big as cats running over people's beds at night. They've eaten into a fridge. So entrenched is one infestation in rural Essex, and it isn't being dealt with for over a year. In towns and villages, jobs have gone, local business have folded, high levels of unemployment and deprivation prevail. Cuts in local transport leave young people without the means to access education or employment opportunities. Public libraries are closing. The report says it, and that message needs to be amplified, so here goes. Please, Parliament, MPs on the left and the right and the centre, please give social rights explicit legal recognition. Our future depends on it.
Thank you, Rebecca, for this plea and testimony. Before giving the floor, I wanted to take the opportunity to ask a question as well from all of the panelists, and particularly on this point about rights. You describe UK policies as deliberately cracking down on benefits. It's a matter of choice. You have all five said it. In the report from Philip Alston, I read, almost any alternative will be more tolerable than seeking government benefits. That's the basic message going out to the people. So how serious is the UK in tackling this crisis? You mentioned a few actions. They don't seem to go as far as your recommendations, quite clearly, nor some of the other recommendations that we have here. And particularly in incorporating the right to food as a human right in its domestic policies. My second question there is, do austerity measures violate rights per se? They do not yet. Right to food is, I would like to hear a little bit more about this right to food as a standard adequate living, and the notion of really putting those rights into the policies and legislation. Anyone?
Let me just say that the different contributions have been terrific. I think they have said much more than I can say. I think in my report and in my comments, and perhaps this is what the government has taken most exception to, what I've tried to emphasise is that this is a deliberate policy choice on the part of this government. I think there was once a day when the beverage reforms of the 1940s and the real social welfare state had full multi-party support. I think what we've seen since 2010 is the rupturing of that consensus, and I don't believe that the current government or its immediate predecessors want to maintain the underlying philosophy. They have opted for a different one, and it's one that means that if you are successful, if you are wealthy, if you have privilege behind you, you will do better, and the government will actually help you in many ways. If you have problems of any sort, you're on your own. And that's a philosophical position. It's not one that I think is consistent with human rights. It's certainly not one that is consistent with the right to food that the Human Rights Watch report has so well underscored. And I think it would be possible for this government to acknowledge that there is a right to food and that no British citizen should have to go to bed hungry at night, let alone have their lives seriously stunted as a result of hunger. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
I think as someone who grew up in the 1980s in the UK during the miners' strike and during an absolute transformation of society and a breakdown of community, a breakdown of responsibility and the emergence of the mantra almost that greed is good, that we were on our own, that it was up to us, that we could make it, we could follow the American dream, so-called. I think it's relevant to say that the framework of human rights in the UK is not really a strong discourse, in a sense, because it has been demonised by various sections of society. It's not the framework that most ordinary people think about. I mean, the good work that Coldo and other organisations are doing in the UK is bringing this out more to the fore, but people don't sort of sit there and say, I have a right to food, I have a right to accommodation. I was reading Amnesty's fantastic version of the human rights to my son as a children's version. And reading it made me think, actually, we do have a right, but we don't think about these things in terms of human rights. And I think that's a really big battle that we have to face. We also need the government to put in place a concerted effort, a concerted inequality and poverty strategy to actually take these problems and look at them in focus, as opposed to the siloed policies we have across different governmental departments, where we're working separately on mental health, separately on poverty. And I think, coming back to Rebecca's point, which is something that we really need to open up far more, is the idea that work pays is more or less ridiculed now. It's a myth. We know that work doesn't pay. People are working for their poverty. And we have to address the role of corporations and business in this. If we're allowing business and corporations to pay such pitiful wages, if we have a national minimum wage that entitles you to an hourly rate but doesn't entitle you to a set number of hours to actually make that rate a living wage, then this situation is only going to continue. So I think we need to look at the wage levels, we need to look at the wage stagnation we've had at the UK, and we need to look at how it's possible that huge corporations are paying very minimum wages so that their workers are going to food banks and having to rely on a range of benefits that taxpayers, ultimately those very same people, are paying for, while profit is returning to shareholders at ever greater levels and shareholders are creaming off the profit.
Thank you. Someone wants to take it here? I know there's also...
Just in response to what how the government can start, I mean, they need to start seeing themselves as like having human rights duties, I think, that they, and there's one thing about that Philip mentioned about incremental change. I think the way forward, we can't change, we'd love to, I mean, complete transformation overnight, that's not going to happen, but incremental change is so first steps. I think for benefits, for universal credit, and these could be done. They could be done today. Like stop sanctions today. How on earth are people meant to get a job or food or anything? You can't function in society if you don't have money. You can't even top up your mobile phone to start looking for a job if you have a sanction. Just stop it now, today. And the other thing is the 5-week wait. This thing is clearly, how are people supposed to manage their lives at all, waiting for 5 weeks? That's a little change that could be done. I'm sure that could be done really, really quickly. Maybe not today, but maybe by the end of the week. Okay. And conditionality, that, and again, it takes no administration to stop the conditionality part. You could just change that contract to give people support to look for work, but not to be punished by sanctions. If they perhaps have a job interview instead of their meeting with their work coach, then they're likely to get the system needs, it can be changed more effectively.
Thank you.
Very briefly. Yes, I think the power of human rights is really depends on what we do with them. So the power of human rights depends on what we do in places like Jaywick in Essex, in places like now South Shields in the northeast, or in places like Newham in London. And I think things are changing, and I expect that human rights-based policies will be push ahead in the coming years. Regarding your second question about austerity, whether austerity is a human rights breach per se or not, I guess the technical answer coming from institutions like here in the UN says that austerity per se is not necessarily a human rights breach, but if you are going to implement regressive measures, you have to comply with certain standards, requirements that the UK government hasn't respected, such as ensure that it is proportionate, ensure that they are fit for purpose, that the measures, welfare reforms are fit for purpose, ensure that people who are most vulnerable are looked after, ensure that it is done based on active participation, consulting with people, and clearly the reports by Human Rights Watch and many others show that these requirements haven't been met, and therefore austerity, as has been implemented in the UK since 2010, has constituted a human rights violation.
Kartik, I'll give you the floor.
I realise we're limited for time, and I could talk endlessly about the right to food in the UK.
Don't.
I won't. I mean, I think it's worth recognising that the UK government has taken certain steps, improving funding for pilot projects around holiday food for kids who are going hungry during the time that schools are closed, improving pilot funding for breakfast clubs where kids show up to school hungry because there's not enough food at home. But these are pilot projects. They're very incremental and they're in early stages, and it's going to take a long time for those to be replicated across the board. The same could be said of, a provisional test of food insecurity measurement, or, and then there are much bigger things that can be done. But I think we're a real far cry away from having the right to food enshrined in domestic law in the UK, not least because there's a socioeconomic duty that's legislated for previously since 2010, sits on the statute book and hasn't been enacted. And at some level we have to look at the way leadership has played its role. The current Prime Minister, one of her first moves was to attempt to scrap that piece of legislation as yet unenacted, calling it ridiculous. And I think we're at a turning point where we are able to say that things like the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to food, are things that matter to people as their rights. And as Koldo said, there's this multi-part test that governments have to go through when undertaking austerity policies. But the other obvious thing is to say, when the evidence is obvious and multiple in the sources, and it's saying to the government the policies aren't working because they're impoverishing people and leaving people without enough food to eat, enough food to feed their kids, then they've got to stand up, they've got to sit up and listen and not ignore that, because plowing on without listening makes the violation worse.